Welcome to session 19 of our class on understanding biblical literature. We're in chapter 11, and on the PowerPoint on the second slide, the title of this chapter is Levels of Meaning. And the first thing we talk about here on this first slide is the idea of spiritualizing. That is, our desire to find a deeper spiritual meaning often takes us right past the actual meaning. By seeking this deeper meaning, we disregard what the text meant to the original audience. The very idea that a text has a deeper meaning is often a very wrong way to start. And as we move to the second or the third slide, it says here the Bible is a spiritual book dealing with spiritual issues. We do not have to spiritualize with our imagination. If we let our imaginations run wild with spiritual meanings, we typically fall prey to the reader response approach. Now remember from the last chapter that the reader response approach is where we ask the question, what does this text mean to me? Okay? What does this text mean to the reader? Well, again, we're not supposed to look for what it means to us without having gone through the interpretive journey. That is to say, seeking first to understand what the author intended for his original audience, and then going through the rest of the steps to see how that meaning applies to us. Okay? So the meaning is what we find in the text. It's not what we put on the text. And to try to spiritualize a text is to, with our own imagination, is to to put something on the text that's just not there. All right, slide number 4. When we think about spiritualizing, again, putting our own meaning on the text, what we need to be looking for, instead of putting our own meaning on the text, is what is known as the literary meaning. That is, this term refers to the meaning the authors have placed in the text. Literary meaning reflects genre, context, historical background, grammar, word meanings, etc. Now, the literary meaning of a biblical text will by necessity be spiritual. That is to say, as Paul put it in his writings, he says we are communicating spiritual ideas through spiritual words. That is to say, if these words are have the stamp of approval of God, then this is the message through these words, okay? The message that comes through these words is a spiritual message, a spiritual meaning. Just like we did also in the last section, or the last chapter, well, now the thought has left me. Well, maybe it'll come back. But again, the idea is that that the meaning of the biblical text will by necessity be spiritual. We don't have to add anything to it in order to, or we don't have to imagine anything about it in order to understand the spiritual meaning. Okay? And I guess what I was trying to say a moment ago was the fact that when we looked at the idea of being holy, okay, I mean, holy in and of itself is a very spiritual idea, okay, a very spiritual thing, to be holy, to be like God, okay, because he says, be holy, for I am holy. The reason we need to be holy is because God is holy. So therefore, that would be an extremely spiritual idea. But when we looked at that diagram that had, God expects us to be holy. I forget exactly the wording of it. He expects his people in all times to be holy. On the Old Testament side, that manifested itself in keeping away from unclean things and to be associated only with clean things, such as what you ate or what you did not eat. The idea of eating pork specifically was an unclean thing, and therefore you were not holy if you ate pork. Well, when you come to the right side of that diagram, excuse me, when you come to the right side of the diagram, we notice that all foods had been declared clean by Jesus, and therefore what you eat today does not make you unclean or unholy, but it's what you do, self-control and so forth. So, if a person says, well, I'm spiritual because of the way I feel, I'm spiritual because of what I think God has done for me, then that would be a definition that does not fit the scriptures. God says that you're spiritual, that you're holy when you do certain things, when you act in certain ways, when you speak in certain ways. That is not speaking with, slander or cursing or whatever. Okay, that would be unholy behavior. Okay, but holy behavior is just that. It's behavior. It's not a feeling that we get. Okay, so again, the text is telling us what exactly holiness is, and therefore it's telling us what is spiritual. All right? What does it mean to be spiritual? And we'll look at that in more detail when we cover chapter 12. What does it mean to be spiritual? So we'll look at that then. Now, concerning levels of meaning, there is a type of interpretation known as allegory. Now, allegory in and of itself is not bad, because even the scripture uses allegory, okay? But what has happened is, as the slide number 5 says, it says, in an effort to make sense of the Old Testament, early Christian scholars developed an interpretive system that acknowledged a literal meaning, but encouraged the interpreter to seek out the spiritual meaning, this deeper meaning, okay? And the way that they did that is found in slide number 6. That is, at play in the early church were at least 3 major hermeneutics that advocated the deeper spiritual meaning. There was the twofold system, which felt that there was a literal meaning and a spiritual meaning. A threefold system that found that there was, or that believed that there was a meaning for the body, for the soul, and for the spirit. 3 different meanings. And then the fourfold system would be the literal meaning, the allegorical meaning, the moral meaning, and the anagogical meaning. Okay? For example, in some interpretation ideas using allegory for the city of Jerusalem in slide number 7. The literal meaning would be the actual city. The allegorical meaning would be the church, okay, the church of Christ. And then the moral meaning would be that Jerusalem stands for the soul of a person. And then the anagogical meaning would be that Jerusalem is the heavenly city of God. Okay? Now, there are times when Jerusalem is used in a figurative way, especially in the book of Revelation, where it says, I saw New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, okay? And, we would have to look at the context and determine what the meaning was in that highly figurative apocalyptic book, which we will talk about later when we get to types of literature in the New Testament, where we will break it down and give extra interpretive steps or interpretive questions and things that we need to think about when we deal with just the Gospels or just the letters of the New Testament or so forth. But, under this allegorical system that the early Christians used, I say early Christians, this would be people of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. This would be after the New Testament was finished and after anyone such as the apostles was around to correct any misunderstandings and so forth. But again, this is just this would be the fourfold system here in slide number 7, and this is an example of how it was used. Now, these methods of interpretation continued until the Protestant Reformation. This would be people like, Luther and others who decided that, the church, in the case of Luther, the Catholic Church, had overstepped its bounds, and he did not want to do away with the Catholic Church. He simply wanted to reform it from the inside. Okay, and but the Reformation brought out certain methods of Bible study that are similar to and sometimes exactly what we are learning in this class, but it did away with the majority of, if not all of, the allegorizing that was being used during that time period before the Reformation. Now, let's move on and define allegory in slide number 9. What is an allegory? A story that uses an extensive amount of symbolism. Okay? For example, or actually another definition given by Sidney Greidanus, he defines it as, this is slide number 10, he defines it as an extended metaphor. That is, a number of elements in a story make up a string of metaphors which have a deeper unified meaning. Now, allegory, like I've said, is a literary technique, and it is used in Scripture. And as is given here in this slide, a non-biblical example of allegory would be Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Now, I've never read Pilgrim's Progress. I've never really read any C.S. Lewis, okay, which I would think that, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe would probably fit the allegory or the allegorical style. I said I've never read C.S. Lewis. I have seen the movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But that's the only understanding I have of C.S. Lewis is that movie. But I would think that, that is what Lewis is trying to do, is allegorize a great deal of the story of the Bible and the plan of salvation that God put forth. But given this definition, let us look at the example given in slide 11 through 14. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and Judah and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. Now, this is a biblical example of allegory in the first 6 verses. But in verse 7, Isaiah himself identifies the meaning of the allegory and tells us what the corresponding elements are. Again, the vineyard is the nation of Israel. The people of Judah are the vines, and justice is what he looked for, and righteousness is what he looked for in the good grapes. But what he got was bad grapes, which, are bloodshed and cries of distress. So if someone wants to take these first 6 verses of Isaiah chapter 5 and make it say something different than what Isaiah has said it means, then they are misusing the text, okay? Because Isaiah has given us the meaning of this allegory. So as we've said, the problem is not allegory. We're in slide number 16. Allegory is an acceptable literary device. The problem emerges when we allegorically interpret a passage that is not an allegory. In other words, we disregard the covenant of communication and the rules of the game, quote unquote. That is, there are certain rules that we go by when we're dealing with different types of literature, okay, within the scriptures. Again, we're talking about genre. What genre is it? There's narrative, there's prophetic, there's apocalyptic, and so forth and so on. And I think that we have dealt with those in former studies. I may not be remembering well here, but let me just make sure that I am speaking correctly. The literary context in chapter 8 is where we dealt with that. So there are certain rules that we must follow in interpreting different types of literature. And, allegory, as it is used in the scriptures, is, again, a perfectly acceptable literary device. Most of the time, though, the scriptures will tell us what was meant by the allegory, or it's clear from the context what was meant by the allegory. And the fact is, as we say there on the bottom of slide 16, few texts in the Bible are allegorical. Okay? In an example of how people have misused this idea of allegory, that they have placed an allegorical meaning on a non-allegorical text, is found in Exodus 27:19. It says, this is slide 17, all the other articles used in the service of the tabernacle, whatever their function, including all the tent pegs for it and those for the courtyard, are to be of bronze. Well, some have taken this to be an allegorical passage, and they have said in slide 18 that the tent pegs represent Jesus and his strength in holding us up. Or another idea that people have is that the tent pegs represent the spikes driven into Jesus' wrists at the crucifixion. So, if you're going to make this passage allegorical, which it's not, it's simply a narrative recording exactly how the tabernacle was supposed to be built, instructions concerning how the tabernacle was supposed to be built. If you're going to make it allegorical, why can't people agree on what the allegorical meaning of it is? Again, I've just given you two totally different meanings. And, the fact is that even if it is allegorical, it cannot mean these two totally different meanings all at the same time. It's just not possible. So again, this passage is not allegorical, and it would be wrong to come up with these meanings. Continuing our discussion of allegorical in slide number 19, allegorical interpreters tend to find a deeper spiritual meaning without asking what the simple symbol might have meant to the biblical audience, that is, to whom it's being written. We need to find out again in the first step of the interpretive journey, what did it mean to them? Okay. Now, another literary technique that is used is typology. That is, another way of saying this is foreshadowing. Okay. Foreshadowing or typology draws from Old Testament passages and then points forward to their fulfillment in Christ. So, in slide number 21, it's further defined as the type would be a biblical event, person, or institution which serves as an example or pattern for other events, persons, or institutions. Okay? For example, when you read the account of the wilderness wanderings, okay, you will find that on a couple of occasions, God gives water to the people through rocks, okay? One time, Moses was told to strike the rock and water would come forth. Another time, he was told to speak to the rock, but he ended up disobeying God and struck the rock and said, "Must we give you water?" Okay, must we provide for you, as if he himself were the one providing the water. And that disobedience caused him to not be able to go into the promised land. But the point is that Paul takes that same rock, okay, that rock becomes a type in the writings of Paul, and he applies it to what is called the antitype. Okay, you have your type, which is the original, and you have your antitype, which is the thing it's being compared to. Okay, or that it stands for. In the New Testament, he says that rock was Christ. Okay, so this particular thing serves as an example or a pattern for Christ himself. That is, he is, as he puts it in the book of John, he said, I give you living water. He said that to the lady in John chapter 4. Okay? So, Paul says, in the same way, God or Christ gives life-giving water. Okay? Or gives life is actually the message. Next, in slide 22, we view typology as being prophetic, a historical event or person in the Old Testament that serves as a prophetic pattern or example of a New Testament event or person. However, it is critical that this prophetic meaning be the one that was intended by the divine author. Thus, the identification must be in the Bible and not merely in our imagination. So again, anytime there is a type and an antitype, the only time that we can say that is the case is when the Bible tells us that is the case. Okay? If we say, well, I think this tent peg stands for the nails that were used to drive through Christ's hands and feet, and the Bible doesn't say anything about that, then we have misidentified a type and an antitype. We simply are making that up in our own imagination. The Bible doesn't say a word about that. So again, understand that anytime you're going to find a type or and its antitype in the New Testament, a type in the Old Testament, antitype in the New, is going to be when the Bible tells you that it is. Okay? Now, here's some typology, okay, out of Psalm 22, starting in slide 23. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. And then he goes on, yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Psalm 22, verses 1 through 5. Now, as is said in slide 25, this psalm provides an excellent example of typology. Note the close correspondence between the psalm and the crucifixion of Jesus. The figurative description of David's sufferings finds literal fulfillment in the suffering of Christ. Of course, clinching this typological connection is the fact that Jesus quotes Psalm 22 from the cross in Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34. And John explicitly states that as the Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothes, they fulfilled Psalm 22:18. So again, if you were to take Psalm 22 and come up with any other type or any other application for a New Testament event or person or institution, then you would be wrong, because the Bible explicitly tells us what is the type and the antitype. Okay? Again, in slide 27, an Old Testament passage usually cannot be confirmed as typological or typological unless the New Testament identifies it as such. Therefore, while other Old Testament texts may bear some similarities to New Testament realities, they cannot be confidently classified as typology unless the New Testament indicates the fulfillment. So we just repeat what we've said because it is so important to understand. You cannot, with any sort of confidence, describe or identify something in the Old Testament with something in the New Testament unless the New Testament tells you exactly what that connection is. Okay? Now, one of the things that is a problem with people trying to find a deeper meaning in the text is found in slide 28, and that is the Bible code. Okay? This is the title of a book which was written, and the authors of the book claimed that there was a special letter sequence code hidden in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And they said that this special code could predict future events. Okay? Now, there is something involving the numbers of the Hebrew language, and that is the fact that it's called gematria, and that biblical Hebrew uses the normal letters of the alphabet not only to represent the sounds of words, but also to represent numbers. And that is a known fact, and it can be found in the scriptures. Okay? But what method was used by the authors of the Bible code was to take this idea further, and they uploaded the entire Hebrew Bible into a computer, and then programmers told the computer to look for words or patterns of words by selecting equidistant letters. That is to say, they're taking the idea of gematria and they're taking it to a point that was never meant to be used or never meant to be a code of any kind. Now, the idea of equidistant letter sequencing is to say, okay, let's take the first letter of the Hebrew Bible and then look at 2 letters away, okay? And keep looking at every second letter all the way through the Hebrew Bible and see if we can come up with anything that is, that could be understood as a prophecy, okay? Well, in the textbook, they point out some things that the authors point out some things that the Bible code claims to have found in the text, okay, and such as the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and other things, okay. But the problem with this is that on slide 31, first you have to deal with probability. Large text with several 100,000 letters present billions of ELS options. Okay? And using the parameters of the Bible code, the book, the Pentateuch alone can yield 18 billion six-letter combinations. Okay? Using this idea. Now, when I said that they might look at the second, the third letter from the first and then go every two, okay, skip one and go to the next one all the way through the Bible. If they don't find anything there, they'll go from the first letter to the third letter. And if they don't find anything there, running that same pattern all the way out through the text of the Hebrew Bible, they'll start with the first letter and go to the fourth letter. And they'll go up to, as many letters as they can go. Just running this machine, running this pattern, this code through the computer, and obviously you're going to come up with a lot of stuff, but that doesn't make it true. Okay. Now, so when you talk about probability, that is an argument against equidistant letter sequencing. Another thing is textual variations in slide 32. The proponents of this type of analysis evidently are unaware of variations in the Hebrew text. While we have great confidence in our text, as we talked about in the early discussions, the early sessions concerning inspiration, the fact is that no two handwritten ancient Hebrew manuscripts are identical. So if you're going to do a complete study, you're going to have to run all the combinations that you can find in one particular Hebrew text. Then you're going to have to put in the variations in the next go around, okay, and figure it, run the same sequences all the way out. And then, again, you could plug in just one variation. And then you'd have to plug in a second variation and put that other variation back. And then how many combinations of variations do you want to use? Okay, maybe the first two variations are the actual text, and the rest of the variations, which amount to hundreds and maybe even thousands, okay, how do you determine what is the correct text as far as this one particular letter being in the right place? Okay? Because, the variations that we're talking about, the fact that no two handwritten ancient Hebrew manuscripts are identical, the variations that we're talking about could very well just be a transposition of letters. It could be just simply, misspelling a word. Okay? I mean, we still understand what the word is supposed to be in the context, but, how many of those variations do you plug in, and which of those variations do you plug in to get what was actually supposed to be the Hebrew text? Okay? So, on and on and on we could go with the problems with this type of biblical interpretation using codes, supposed codes, to interpret the scriptures. Okay? Well, that brings us to the end of this particular section. And because we have a lot of extra minutes in other sessions, we will just simply stop here because I don't want to get into chapter 12 at this point. I want to do it all in one session, or actually it's going to take maybe 2 or 3 sessions is what it's going to take. But I want to keep it as much together as I can because there's a lot of material there that we need to go over. All right, so I hope you have understood this chapter, that I've explained it in a way that you can understand it. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.